All right, well, greetings, thankful family, thankful ones. Greetings from Conway, South Carolina. I'm coming to you to deliver the sermon for the, is it the 6th Sunday, 7th Sunday after Pentecost? I can't remember. Anyway, it's proper 11, and those are the readings for today. So I'll get to the sermon in a minute, but I just wanted to take a little bit of time to say hello, to send greetings from St. Anne's Episcopal Church here in Conway, and to give you a little bit of an update on how things are going with me. Before I jump into that, though, I do want to say thank you to all of you, especially to Mother Layla, for inviting me to give the sermon for this Sunday. It's a really great opportunity. I was thrilled to hear from Layla and to catch back up with her and to be invited to deliver a word to y'all this morning. So anyway, just recently I celebrated 4 years of ministry at St. Anne's in Conway, and the big news from us is that we recently, back in sort of the end of March, acquired a building for our church. So we now have a church home that we can't really be in yet, but we're getting there. We're getting there. I can tell people it's been 4 years since I've been in Conway, and they haven't run me out of town on a rail quite yet. So obviously the training that I received at Thankful did a good job. So thank you. The other thing, as you can see, the big news from our lives is that we have a new addition to the Donahue family. This is David Douglas Donahue, who was born back in December 16th of last year. So his introduction to the world, as you can imagine, has been a little strange because 2020 is just going very oddly, but we're thrilled to have him, and I can't wait to introduce y'all to him in person. And that being said, I really look forward to a time in the future where Davis and David and I can be up there and I can actually preach in person and celebrate with y'all in person. So we look forward to that time. And now, without further ado, to the task at hand. Okay. All right, now I know that no one's going to be able to sort of see each other, but show of hands, how many of y'all have a garden, and how many of you have ever spent time in your garden pulling weeds? How many of you have ever had it happen that when you were out in your garden pulling weeds, you pulled a weed that you thought was a weed, but was actually a flower, or maybe a tomato plant? So I remember I was once living in Michigan, and we had a young man visit who wanted to help out in our garden, but who had failed to tell us that he had no experience whatsoever with gardening. Not knowing this, we put him to work in the garden, and we told him to pull up the weeds near a row of beans. And you can imagine what happened when he had finished and came back. The row was completely clear of all vegetable life, beans and everything. So you can imagine how wonderful that was. Anyway, that guy was a special case, but I think that most of us can tell the difference between a weed and a plant that has been deliberately planted. I know that, at least in my yard, I know a dandelion when I see one, and unfortunately I'm quite well acquainted with crabgrass. So if you're a gardener, my guess is you don't want weeds growing in your garden. And that simple observation from everyday life is the basis of the parable that Jesus tells about the weeds, and the wheat. Only it's not just any old weed that Jesus is talking about. Some of y'all might not recall this, but I'm actually quite a big fan of language, and I hope you'll forgive me for making this point about the meanings of certain words. But what is translated for us in the gospel as weeds is actually a very specific kind of weed. In Greek, the word is zizanion, and it's a kind of darnel or ryegrass that looks a lot like wheat until it ripens. So in the parable, what we have is a field of wheat, and mixed into that wheat is a weed that looks an awful lot like wheat. And it's hard to tell the difference between the two until the weed has ripened. So I don't know if that actually helps us to understand this parable any better, but I think it provides us with some insight into why the owner of the field does not want the workers to pull up the weeds. I don't think it's just because the root structures are so bound up together that pulling up the weeds would result in pulling up the wheat as well. I think it's because the workers, and the owner knows this, the workers would not be able to tell the difference between what is a weed and what was wheat. So, in their eagerness to pull up the weeds, they also pull up everything, not knowing the difference. So the owner's solution is to protect everything, the weeds and the wheat, to protect it all, in the expectant hope that if everything is protected, eventually things will work out. Now I'll let you draw out the lesson on that one. But in any case, I think that this parable is an excellent parable for the church. It's an excellent parable about the church, because the church has always struggled to maintain a sort of middle ground between two extremes. On the one hand, there's the mentality that the church should be pure, completely free of weeds, completely free of sin, completely free of any kind of imperfection, that it should be a perfect place where perfect people can give thanks to a perfect God for the fact that they're perfect. And that kind of pure church is one end of the spectrum, and that's actually where the term Puritan comes from. Incidentally, I don't know if y'all know the joke about the line about Puritanism being the overriding fear that someone somewhere is having a good time. Anyway, the other end of the spectrum is a mentality that the church shouldn't expect its members to live up to the promises that they have actually made in following Jesus. It's a mentality that says accountability and responsibility shouldn't actually be a part of belonging to God's kingdom, that it's just whatever it is, it doesn't matter. It's a mentality that says God doesn't really care much about the difference between weeds and wheat. And ultimately, it's a mentality that says we shouldn't care about our own or anyone else's growth. Now those are sort of the two extreme ends, and neither has proved particularly effective when it comes to spreading the gospel. Because the puritanical end demands such a high standard of righteousness that few, if any, can sustain it for very long. And the anything goes mentality winds up not really standing for anything. So the challenge, I think, of spreading the gospel and being the church is to find the middle ground between these two extremes. And I think that when the church is at its best, it resists the anything goes mentality by saying that the church is a place where we are expected to grow and to be disciplined in our approach to knowing God and loving God. And on the other end, it resists Puritanism by exercising what some may deride as indiscriminate inclusivity, by opening its doors wide enough so that everyone can come in and find a place to grow. Now, in our neck of the woods, and by that I mean the American South, I happen to think that Puritanism is the more tempting or more prevalent of those two extremes. So, to bring in the words of the parable, to bring those back into focus, there's something I'd like us to consider about who the characters in the parable are and what role they play. So if you remember the explanation that Jesus gives about the parable, Jesus points out that the sower is the Son of Man, the field is the world, and the good seed are the children of the kingdom, and so on and so forth. Only there's one set of characters that does not get a parallel assignment in Jesus' explanation. And it's the workers who tell the sower that weeds have been sown in the field. It's the ones who want to pluck up the weeds and cast them out. They don't appear again in the explanation of the parable. Now you might have expected them to. Maybe they would have been the eventual reapers. But in the parable, in the explanation of the parable, the reapers are separate characters. So what that means for us when it comes to deciding what or who is wheat and what or who is a weed, that's not our job. When it comes to deciding who belongs to the kingdom of God and who does not belong to the kingdom of God, that is not our job. And the reason it's not our job is because we're not really in a place to know the immediate difference between weeds and wheat. Our job is simply to grow as children of God. Our job is to be wheat. And I'll add here that if you're worried about whether you're wheat or weeds, the mere fact that you're worried means that you're wheat. Essentially, our job is to grow and to be patient. So even though it may be bad advice for those of you who are gardeners, when you go back out into the world, I would encourage you not to go looking for weeds to pluck up. Instead, I would encourage you to look for ways to grow more fully into the child of God that you are. Look for ways to help others to grow more fully into the children of God that they are. Do what you can to make sure that the wheat keeps growing. In the end, God will bring in the harvest. And, if my guess is correct, we may wind up discovering that God has transformed even what we thought were weeds into wheat.